Most of us think that the biggest risk at work is just a toxic boss, unpaid overtime, or a missed bonus. But what do you do when you realize your entire workplace is a carefully planned psychological trap, and you were set up to be the fall guy from day one? Today's stories, sent in by viewers, prove that the people you trust the most, whether it's a lifelong best friend or a mentor you look up to, can destroy your career and your mental health without blinking an eye if the price is right. These emails honestly gave me chills, and they show that in the business world, loyalty means absolutely nothing. Let's get straight into the first story, because what happened sounds like a sick corporate thriller. I was sitting at my desk back in November, staring at a bank balance that was rapidly approaching zero. If you have ever worked as a freelance designer, you know exactly how brutal the dry spells can be. The market had completely tanked, clients were ghosting me, and the pressure of upcoming rent was making it hard to breathe. I was genuinely considering throwing in the towel and looking for a minimum wage retail job just to survive. And then, out of nowhere, my phone rang. It was Tom. Tom and I went back more than a decade. We met in high school, played in the same gaming clans, shared cheap pizza, and eventually got into the tech industry together. I went into UI and UX design, while Tom went into project management. Tom was always the charismatic, ultra-polished guy who could sell ice to an Eskimo. He wore the sharp suits, had the latest gadgets, and always seemed to know the right people. He told me on the phone that his agency was looking for a senior designer immediately. They had just landed a massive fintech project for an international client. The budget was insane, and it was fully remote. He told me he had already talked to his boss, Clara, and convinced her that I was a design god. He set up an interview for the very next day. I felt like a drowning man who had just been thrown a lifeline. The next morning, I hopped on a Zoom call with Clara. She was the definition of a cold, intimidating corporate executive. No small talk, no smiling, just sharp, calculated questions. She looked through my portfolio, asked a few highly technical questions about information architecture, and then closed her laptop. She told me that because Tom vouched for me, and because she trusted Tom implicitly, the job was mine. The contract was freelance B2B, and the monthly retainer they offered was more money than I had ever made in a 3-month span before. But there was one specific catch. Clara explained that because of a highly restrictive non-disclosure agreement with the client, I could not use my own hardware or my own regular accounts. They were going to ship me a secured, encrypted corporate laptop. But until that arrived, which would take a week or two, I had to log into the company servers using a VPN and work directly through a secondary profile tied to Tom's master account. Looking back now, that was a massive, glowing red flag. But when you are down to your last few $100s and someone offers you a life-changing amount of money, your brain finds ways to rationalize everything. I told myself it was just standard corporate security, and I agreed. The first month was absolute paradise. The project was incredibly engaging, building a high-end cryptocurrency trading interface. Tom was my direct manager, so every morning we would hop on Slack, joke around, do our quick daily stand-up meeting, and then I would grind out designs. Clara barely intervened, only popping up occasionally to drop a compliment on my progress. I felt like I had finally made it. The cracks started appearing right after the Christmas break. One morning, I logged into our team Slack channel and found absolute chaos. Clara had tagged the entire channel in all caps. The client had just discovered that a malicious script, designed to scrape sensitive metadata, had been embedded into the test server. The origin of the script was traced back to a batch of SVG icon files that had been uploaded the previous evening. My stomach dropped. I was the one who designed and exported those SVG files, but I knew for an absolute fact that I hadn't embedded any code into them. I immediately called Tom on his personal line. He answered after a few rings, sounding surprisingly calm. I was pacing around my room, sweating, telling him that someone must have corrupted my files or that there was a glitch. Tom told me to calm down. He told me that the client's internal developers probably messed up the integration and were just trying to shift the blame onto the agency. He told me to stay quiet, let him handle Clara, and just keep working on the next sprint. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my best friend. But after that day, the entire atmosphere changed. Clara became an absolute nightmare. She started micromanaging my hours, demanding minute-by-minute tracking of my workflow. She would leave passive-aggressive comments on my Figma boards at 3 or 4 in the morning. And then things got truly bizarre. I started noticing that my source design files were changing overnight. I would finish my shift at 5 in the evening, save everything, and close my laptop. When I logged back in the next morning, there would be subtle modifications. Hidden layers inside the interface layouts, weird data export components that I never created. When I checked the version history in Figma, it clearly showed that the edits were made by the user profile assigned to me, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning. I genuinely started to question my own sanity. I thought maybe the stress was getting to me, or maybe I was sleepwalking and opening my computer in the middle of the night. To prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind, I installed a third-party activity tracker on my local machine that logged every single second the screen was active. A few days later, it happened again. A major file layout was altered at 2:45 a.m. I checked my local activity tracker. My computer had been completely asleep and untouched all night. Someone else was using my login credentials from a completely different location. I immediately messaged Tom, telling him that our security had been breached, that someone was ghost logging into my profile, and that we needed to report it to Clara and the client's IT team immediately. Tom called me back instantly, and for the first time in 10 years, he screamed at me. He was furious. He told me I was being an idiot, and that if I went to Clara with this, we would both be fired on the spot. He reminded me that I was still using a profile connected to his network via the VPN because my corporate laptop was still stuck in transit. He said that if Clara found out I had leaked or lost my credentials, the agency would sue us for breach of contract and ruin us financially. He told me he would manually reset the VPN keys, change the passwords, and that I needed to shut up and let him secure the system. The sheer aggression in his voice terrified me. I backed down, but a sick feeling settled deep in my gut. Tom started treating me like dirt on our professional calls, completely ignoring my input and acting incredibly distant. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong, so I decided to do some investigating of my own. Since I was still routing my work through that specific VPN configuration Tom had set up, I managed to access the network traffic logs that were cached on my local system. I am not a cybersecurity expert, but I know how to read basic IP addresses and location data. I spent an entire Saturday afternoon matching the timestamps of the midnight file modifications with the incoming IP connections in the log. When I finally mapped the location of the IP address that was logging into my profile at 3 in the morning, my heart completely stopped. The connection wasn't coming from some random hacker overseas. It was coming from an apartment complex in Lincoln Park, Chicago. That was Tom's address. My own childhood best friend was the one logging into my account in the dead of night. I sat there in total silence, trying to piece together why he would do this. I went back and meticulously examined the hidden layers he had been inserting into my design files. I realized they weren't just random edits. He was using the design file structure as a Trojan horse to extract proprietary backend logic and client data structures. And because he was doing it under my username, the digital paper trail pointed directly at me. Tom was systematically stealing the client's intellectual property to sell it off, and he had set me up to be the perfect fall guy. If the client ever audited the system, I would be the one facing corporate espionage charges and prison time, while Tom would walk away completely clean. By Monday morning, the anxiety was so overwhelming I could barely breathe. I knew I had to bypass Tom and go straight to Clara, even if it meant getting fired. I needed to protect myself, but before I could even draft the email, an urgent Slack notification popped up on my screen. Clara had called an emergency meeting. When I joined the Zoom call, Clara and Tom were already there. Tom looked devastatingly sad, shaking his head and staring at the desk. Clara looked like an executioner. She didn't waste any time. She looked directly into her camera and told me that the client had just confirmed that their core proprietary trading algorithm had been leaked and was currently being implemented by a direct competitor. She said their internal security audit had tracked the data extraction directly to my user profile. Before I could even open my mouth to defend myself, Tom spoke up. His voice was trembling, putting on an absolute Oscar-worthy performance. He looked at Clara and said he was deeply sorry that he was the one who brought me into the company, and that he had no idea I was drowning in personal debt and would resort to corporate theft. He looked at me through the screen and asked how I could do this to him after everything he had done for me. The sheer audacity of his betrayal made my head spin. I felt a wave of pure rage wash over me. I started shouting, telling Clara that Tom was lying, that I had tracked the IP logs to his apartment, and that he was the one who had been logging in at night to steal the data. Tom just let out a cold, condescending laugh. He told Clara that I was clearly unstable, that we were sharing a network infrastructure, and that I was just fabricating fake logs to save myself from going to jail. He told Clara they needed to call the police immediately. And right then, at the absolute peak of the tension, the first massive plot twist hit. Clara, who had been sitting silently throughout our shouting match, slowly took off her glasses, rubbed her eyes, and let out a long, exhausted sigh. She looked at Tom and told him to shut up. Tom froze. He asked her what she meant. Clara leaned forward, a terrifyingly calm expression on her face. She told Tom that she wasn't an idiot, and that she had known exactly what he was doing since the very first week of the project. She revealed that before the project even launched, she had hired an independent cybersecurity firm to monitor the network. They had installed silent keyloggers and screen capture software on the master server. She knew every single entity Tom had been communicating with. She had records of his encrypted chats, and she knew exactly how much money he was being paid by the competitor to leak the data. She told Tom that I was just a pawn he brought in, and she had intentionally let Tom think his plan was working just so she could gather undeniable, airtight evidence of his entire operation. Tom's face drained of all color. He looked like he was about to vomit. He was completely trapped, and for a split second, I felt a massive wave of relief wash over me. I thought Clara was my savior. I thanked her, telling her I was so grateful she found the truth. But then Clara turned her icy gaze toward me, and that is when the second, far more sinister plot twist dropped. She told me to stop talking, because nobody was going to the police. Tom stuttered, asking her why she wouldn't turn him in if she had all the evidence, especially since the client was going to ruin her agency with lawsuits over the leak. Clara smiled. It was the most soulless, terrifying smile I have ever seen in my life. She looked at Tom and told him that the client wouldn't sue because the competitor company that Tom had been selling the stolen data to was actually a shell corporation 90% owned by Clara's own husband. My mind completely blanked out. I couldn't comprehend what she was saying. The entire thing was an elaborate corporate laundering scheme. Clara and her husband wanted to steal the client's multi-million-dollar trading technology for their own secondary business, but they couldn't do it legally without violating their contracts and facing massive lawsuits. So, they set a trap. They knew Tom was greedy and corruptible, so they practically left the door open for him to steal it. Tom thought he was running a brilliant corporate heist, but in reality, he was just transferring the data directly to Clara's husband for a fraction of its actual worth. And I was brought into the mix for one specific reason. If the client ever launched a federal investigation into the leak, the digital footprint would lead straight to an outside, independent freelance designer who was using unverified credentials. The official narrative would be that a rogue contractor sabotaged the system. Clara's agency would look like an innocent victim. Her husband's company would keep the stolen technology, and I would be the one taking the fall in a court of law. Clara looked at both of us and laid out the final terms. The project was officially terminated. Both of our contracts were cancelled immediately. She pulled up a document on her screen and told us that we were both going to sign a highly specialized, airtight non-disclosure agreement. In exchange for our absolute silence, she was going to pay both of us a massive severance package, equivalent to a full year of senior-level salary. She looked at Tom and told him that if he refused to sign, she would hand her files over to the FBI and ensure he spent the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for corporate espionage. Then she looked at me and said that if I refused to sign, she would delete all the evidence against Tom, present the original falsified logs to the client, and use her massive legal team to ensure that I was prosecuted as the sole perpetrator of the theft, leaving me with a mountain of debt and a destroyed reputation. She gave us exactly 10 minutes to digitally sign the paperwork. Tom signed it within 60 seconds. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely type. I sat there staring at the screen, realizing that I had absolutely no cards left to play. The system was completely rigged against me from the day I took the interview. If I tried to play the hero, I would be crushed by a corporate machine that had already covered its tracks perfectly. I signed the papers. The Zoom call ended immediately. My access to the Slack channels, the servers, and the project files vanished into thin air within seconds. That was a year ago. The severance money hit my account a week later, and I used it to completely disappear from the corporate tech scene. I went back to doing small, local freelance work for independent businesses. I blocked Tom on every single platform, changed my phone number, and moved to a completely different city. For the first 6 months, I lived in constant fear, looking over my shoulder every time someone knocked on my door, wondering if the corporate house of cards had finally collapsed. Eventually, I looked up the agency online. Clara and her husband had successfully sold off both of their companies to a massive European investment fund for an astronomical amount of money, completely erasing the digital trail of what they had done. Tom actually managed to parlay his experience on that fintech project into a high-level executive role at another major firm, completely unbothered by the fact that he had tried to destroy his best friend's life for a paycheck. The corporate world is filled with people who view human beings as nothing more than disposable assets and shields. Always protect your data, always demand your own secure hardware, never work under someone else's login. And most importantly, remember that in business, a childhood friendship means absolutely nothing when millions of dollars are on the table. That is the end of the viewer's story. It is honestly terrifying how easily someone can be framed when they are desperate for work. Let me know what you think about this situation in the comments below. Alright, prepare for the second one. The viewer who sent this asked to remain anonymous because the industry they work in is incredibly tight-knit and the fallout from this story is still settling. I am going to read this directly from their perspective, just as they wrote it to me, because their words carry a weight that I don't want to change. Let us get straight into it. To understand how I ended up losing my mind, losing my health, and almost losing my entire career, you have to understand where I was 3 years ago. I was working at a massive, soul-crushing corporate marketing firm. The pay was decent, but I was just a cog in the machine. I spent my days designing basic banner ads and corporate templates. I was desperate for a creative outlet, desperate to do work that actually mattered. And then I met Sarah. Sarah was a legend in our local creative scene. She had spent a decade winning awards at major agencies before splitting off to launch her own high-end boutique design firm called Vanguard Creative. I met her at an industry networking event, where she was the keynote speaker. She was magnetic, sharp, flawlessly dressed, fiercely intelligent, and she spoke about design with a passion that instantly hooked me. After her speech, I approached her, trembling, and handed her a business card with a link to my hidden portfolio, the passion projects I did at night that my corporate job never let me touch. 2 days later, Sarah called me personally. She didn't have an assistant do it. She told me she had looked at my portfolio and saw a rare spark. She invited me to a coffee shop, and for 2 hours, she bombed my work. She told me I was wasting my talent in the corporate meat grinder. She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I am building a family at Vanguard. I don't want employees, I want partners. I want to mentor you and turn you into a powerhouse." I quit my corporate job the very next day. I didn't care that the base pay at Vanguard was slightly lower because Sarah promised a heavy commission and bonus structure tied to the accounts I would help bring in. For the first 6 months, I felt like I was living a dream. Vanguard was a small team. just 8 of us working out of a beautiful, converted loft downtown. Sarah was the ultimate cool boss. She bought us lunch every Tuesday, kept a fully stocked bar in the break room, and would routinely call me out during team meetings to praise my vision. She became my entire world. Because the team was so small and the work was so intense, we routinely put in 12-hour days. Sarah would stay late with me, ordering pizza, sharing bottles of wine, and listening to me talk about my life. I opened up to her about everything. I told her about my childhood, my insecurities, my past financial struggles, and how much this opportunity meant to me. She would nod sympathetically, hug me, and say, "You are safe here. We protect our own." Slowly, imperceptibly, she started isolating me. If I mentioned that I was going to miss a late night brainstorming session because I had dinner plans with my childhood friends, Sarah's face would drop. She would look hurt and say, "Of course, go ahead. It's just that the team is really counting on your input tonight. I guess I just assumed your drive matched ours." It's hard when your old friends don't understand the level of execution required at this tier, isn't it? She made it feel like my friends were dragging me down, like only Vanguard truly understood me. Over time, I stopped hanging out with anyone outside of work. My text messages were exclusively from Sarah and my coworkers. I was completely trapped in her ecosystem, but I was happy because I felt valued. The first real crack in the illusion appeared when we landed the bid for Apex apparel. Apex was a legacy fashion brand looking for a total digital transformation. It was a multi-million-dollar account, the biggest contract Vanguard had ever smelled. Sarah assigned me as the lead creative director for the pitch. For 2 straight months, I barely slept. I lived on energy drinks and Adderall. I poured my entire soul into the Apex brand strategy, designing a revolutionary e-commerce interface and a brilliant interactive launch campaign. The day of the pitch, we went into the Apex corporate headquarters. I ran the presentation. I spoke for 45 minutes, completely capturing the room. The executives were nodding, smiling, and taking notes. When we walked out, Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it left a bruise and whispered, "You just saved this agency. Your bonus is going to change your life." 3 days later, we got the official word Vanguard won the account. The office erupted into chaos. We drank champagne, cheered, and celebrated late into the night. The next morning, I sent Sarah a polite, professional email asking to schedule a brief meeting to finalize the performance bonus and commission structure that was tied to the Apex win, per our initial verbal agreement when I was hired. Sarah didn't reply to the email. Instead, she walked out of her office, walked past my desk without looking at me, and went to lunch. An hour later, she called me into her office and closed the door. The warmth was entirely gone from her face. She sat behind her desk, looked at my email on her screen, and sighed with a look of deep, profound disappointment. "I have to say, I am incredibly hurt," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We'd just achieved something monumental as a family, and your immediate instinct is to hold out your hand for cash. It feels incredibly cold and transactional. I thought you were different. I thought you cared about the art, about the culture we built here." I felt an immediate wave of intense guilt. I started stammering, apologizing, explaining that I just had student loans to pay off. Sarah waved her hand, cutting me off. "Look, the financial reality of an agency this size is complex," she said. "The Apex contract is structured in milestones. We haven't actually seen a dime of that money yet. I am putting your bonus on hold until the first major deliverable is approved by their board in 3 months. If you are as committed as you say you are, that shouldn't be an issue." I agreed. I forced a smile and thanked her, feeling like a greedy child who had just been scolded by a parent. But that conversation flipped a switch in Sarah's mind. The love bombing stopped instantly, and the systematic destruction of my sanity began. Over the next 2 months, Sarah turned my daily life into a living hell, through the most calculated gaslighting I have ever witnessed. She started utilizing a psychological tactic meant to make me entirely dependent on her approval, while simultaneously destroying my confidence in my own eyes and the eyes of my peers. It started with the design files. I would spend all day working on a layout for Apex, perfect every single pixel, upload it to our shared server, and leave for the night. The next morning, I would open the file and find that elements had been moved. Colors had been altered to look terrible, and text had been deleted. During our morning stand-up meetings, Sarah would share her screen, pull up my altered file in front of the entire team, and say, "I am really worried about you. Look at this alignment. This is amateur work. Are you sleeping okay? Your attention to detail has completely fallen off a cliff." I would stare at the screen in absolute horror, whispering that I hadn't left the file like that. Sarah would give me a sad, patronizing look. "The version history says you were the last one to edit it at 600 p.m. Dear, please, just focus. We cannot afford mistakes on Apex." I started doubting my own eyes. I started taking manual screenshots of my files before I logged off, saving them locally on my personal desktop, just to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But the psychological torture didn't stop there. Sarah began changing meeting times on my Google Calendar without telling me. I would be sitting at my desk working, and suddenly my phone would buzz with a message from Sarah. "Where are you? We are in the conference room with the client. Your absence is incredibly unprofessional." I would run into the room, sweating, looking erratic, only to find the client staring at me like I was a liability. When I would look at my calendar later, the meeting time had been shifted back an hour. I knew I hadn't missed the original notification, but the digital evidence always pointed to me being wrong. She started copying the entire staff on emails, criticizing my basic administrative tasks. If I submitted an expense report an hour late, she would reply, all saying, "If you cannot manage your calendar, perhaps we need to re-evaluate your capacity to lead the Apex creative track." I was completely broken. I lost 15 pounds in 6 weeks. My hands shook constantly. I stopped sleeping because I was terrified of what would happen when I opened my laptop the next morning. I felt completely isolated because my co-workers, sensing that I was radioactive, started ignoring me in the break room. Sarah had successfully painted a narrative that I was a burnt-out, incompetent designer who was riding on her coattails. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday evening in February. Everyone had left the office around 7:00 p.m. But I stayed behind to fix an entirely new set of mistakes Sarah claimed to have found in our final brand manual for Apex. The manual was due to be printed and shipped to the client's board directors the following morning. Around 9:00 p.m., I walked to the communal kitchen to grab a coffee. As I passed Sarah's office, I noticed the light was off, but her door was slightly ajar. I heard her voice. She was still there, sitting in the dark. On a phone call, I was about to knock and ask her a question about a font choice, but then I heard my name, followed by a sound that chilled me to my core. Sarah was laughing. It wasn't her warm, corporate laugh. It was a cold, sharp, vicious cackle. "I am telling you, it worked perfectly," Sarah was saying into her headset. I could tell she was talking to an old agency buddy of hers. "They are completely broken. I have them checking their own shadow at this point. I manually shifted 3 of their layout grids over the weekend and tore them apart for it on Monday morning. They actually apologized to me." I froze in the hallway, the coffee mug heavy in my hand. My breath caught in my throat. "Why?" "Because the board bonus is due next month," Sarah continued, her tone dripping with casual malice. "If I let them think they are a genius, they are going to demand the full 15% commission on the Apex account. But if they think they are on the verge of being fired for incompetence, they will take whatever scraps I throw at them, just to keep their job. It is so much cheaper to manage a depressed genius who doubts their own value than to pay a confident one who knows their worth. By the time the final project launches, I'll place them on a performance improvement plan, make their life intolerable, and force them to resign. I get the credit. Vanguard keeps the entire commission, and I replace them with a fresh, hungry graduate next season. I stood there in the dark hallway, and it felt like the entire universe shifted. The fog that had been clouding my brain for the past 3 months vanished instantly. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't failing. I wasn't an amateur. I was the target of a systematic, calculated psychological execution designed to rob me of my money and my intellectual property. I didn't confront her. My heart was pounding like a war drum, but my mind suddenly became dangerously calm. I quietly walked back to my desk, packed my laptop, my notebook, and my personal hard drive into my backpack. I walked out of the building, got into my car, and drove home. I didn't sleep that night, but for the first time in months, it wasn't because of anxiety. It was because I spent 9 hours building an absolute weapon. You see, because I had been paranoid about my sanity, I had saved everything. I had local screenshots of every single design file before and after the unauthorized modifications. I had logs of the file metadata proving the changes were made from Sarah's administrative account, while my local machine was offline. I had a screen recording of my calendar displaying the exact moment a meeting time was altered by an external administrator. And most importantly, I had kept a detailed, dated journal of every single piece of verbal abuse, every late night panic attack, and every shifting deadline. But I knew that if I just went to HR, nothing would happen, because Vanguard's HR was an external consultant hired by Sarah herself. I needed to strike where it would actually hurt her. At 8:00 a.m. the next morning, I sent an email. I didn't send it to Sarah. I sent it directly to the Chief Marketing Officer and the Executive Board of Apex Apparel, the multi-million-dollar client. In the email, I introduced myself as the lead creative director who had built their entire brand strategy. I attached a beautifully organized, comprehensive PDF dossier. It didn't just contain the evidence of her harassment, it contained the original, uncorrupted design files that I had saved on my personal drive, contrasted against the butchered version Sarah had been trying to force through. I explained that the creative integrity of their multi-million-dollar campaign was being actively sabotaged by the agency's owner to avoid paying internal commissions, and that the team currently handling their account was functioning under an abusive structure that violated Apex's own public corporate code of ethics regarding supplier diversity and fair labor practices. I concluded the email by stating that I was resigning from Vanguard Creative Effective immediately due to a hostile and fraudulent work environment, and that I would be happy to hand over the full intellectual property rights of my original design work directly to Apex if their legal team required it. I hit send. Then I turned off my phone, went to bed, and slept for 12 hours straight. When I woke up and turned my phone back on, I had 37 missed calls from Sarah, 2 Slack notifications, and a dozen texts from my former coworkers. Sarah's texts went from furious threats of legal action for breach of contract to desperate pleas asking me to come into the office to talk things through like a family. I ignored all of them. 2 days later, I received an email from the head of legal at Apex Apparel. They thanked me for my transparency and informed me that they had initiated an immediate internal audit of Vanguard's deliverables. The fallout was catastrophic for Vanguard. Apex didn't just pull their account, they invoked a specific morality and performance clause in their contract, terminating the relationship with immediate effect and demanding the return of their initial retainer fee. Because the industry talk travels faster than light, 2 of Vanguard's other major clients pulled their business within the month, terrified of being associated with an agency facing a massive potential lawsuit over fraudulent file manipulation and labor abuse. Vanguard Creative collapsed within 90 days. Sarah had to shut down the loft, lay off the entire staff, and her reputation in our local market was completely, permanently incinerated. She went from being a keynote speaker at conventions to a pariah whom no one would touch because her name became synonymous with management toxicity and liability. As for me, it took a long time to heal. I spent 6 months in therapy working through the deep-seated imposter syndrome and the trauma of that gaslighting. I didn't work in design for nearly a year, but the story has a happy ending. 5 months ago, the CMO of Apex Apparel reached out to me. They were building an internal, in-house creative agency to handle their global branding, and they offered me the role of senior creative director with a salary that was double what Sarah had ever promised me, along with full corporate benefits and a strictly enforced 500 PM log off policy. I work in an environment now where my work is respected, my boundaries are honored, and my success belongs entirely to me. That is the end of the email. Honestly, hearing stories like this makes my blood boil, but it is incredibly satisfying to see a predator get caught in their own trap. It is a harsh reminder that the corporate world often hides wolves in sheep's clothing, and people who use the word family to describe a workplace are almost always trying to exploit your boundaries. Always trust your gut, always keep your receipts, and never let anyone convince you that your sanity is worth a job title. What do you think about how this viewer handled the situation? Would you have walked out quietly? Or would you have dropped the nuclear option on the client's desk, just like they did? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Take care of yourselves, set your boundaries, and I will see you in the next video.